March 17, 1966. Hamilton, Ontario. A turquoise cruiser sedan rolled through the factory gates on Victoria Street, the last Studebaker that would ever be built, not just in Canada, anywhere on Earth. The workers who watched it leave had built 179,325 vehicles in 18 years. They had turned a wartime gun factory into something they were proud of. They had kept the lights on long after South Bend went dark. And someone had thought to tie a banner across the car's hood before it left more Studebakers from Hamilton for the world. There would be no more. How does a company that survived the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression end up here in a mid-sized steel city in Ontario with 700 workers watching the very last car disappear down the road? The answer isn't about Hamilton. Hamilton was the most profitable operation Studebaker had left. The answer is about what happens when a great company runs out of road and chooses a loyal city to be the place where it finally stops. In February 1852, 2 brothers opened a blacksmith shop in South Bend, Indiana, with $68 between them and a single anvil. Henry and Clement Studebaker had no particular ambitions beyond keeping the shop alive. What they built instead was the largest wagon manufacturer in the world. The timing was perfect. America was pushing west, and settlers needed wagons that wouldn't break down on the prairie. Studebaker wagons earned a reputation for being overbuilt, heavier than they needed to be, stronger than anyone asked for, lasting longer than the buyer expected. That reputation would define the company for the next century, and ultimately contribute to its undoing. During the Civil War, the United States government contracted Studebaker to supply military wagons to the Union Army. The company delivered. By the 1880s, Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company had become the dominant force in American wagon production, not through clever marketing, but through an almost stubborn commitment to quality that customers noticed and competitors struggled to match. The transition to automobiles was neither sudden nor reluctant. Studebaker began experimenting with electric vehicles in 1902, then gasoline-powered cars in 1904, initially through manufacturing partnerships rather than full production. By 1911, the company had taken complete ownership of its automotive operations and committed entirely to the new industry. The wagon business wound down by 1918. Studebaker had made the crossing, and it had done so without losing the institutional character that had made it great, a belief that the vehicle itself, built properly, was the argument. Through the 1920s and 1930s, Studebaker competed in the upper-middle tier of the American market. Designer Raymond Loewy, one of the most celebrated industrial designers of the 20th century, brought a visual identity to the brand that no other independent could match. The 1947 Starlight Coupe, with its wraparound rear window and low, swept silhouette, arrived on showroom floors before any of the big 3 had managed to replace their pre-war designs. Studebaker ran advertisements that read, "First by far with a post-war car." And for once the boast was accurate. The post-war years were the high water mark. In 1950, Studebaker produced approximately 320,000 cars and trucks, its best year on record, and a figure that placed it firmly in the conversation as a major American automaker. The company had roughly 22,000 workers in South Bend. It had cachet, momentum, and a loyal customer base that valued substance over flash. What it did not have was the production scale to survive what was coming. The big 3, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, controlled the American automobile industry, not through better products, necessarily, but through sheer manufacturing volume. They could absorb losses during price wars that would cripple a smaller company. They could invest in retooling and redesign on a cycle that kept dealers excited and customers returning. They could afford mistakes that Studebaker simply could not. By 1954, Studebaker's annual sales had dropped to roughly 100,000 units, and the company was carrying a deficit of $26 million. That year, it merged with Packard Motor Car Company, another respected independent that was also struggling. A UAW representative at the time called it two drunks trying to help each other across the street. The image was uncharitable, but not inaccurate. Both companies were in trouble before they joined hands. The merger made them larger without making them stronger. But in Hamilton, Ontario, none of that had happened yet. There, in a converted wartime factory on Victoria Street, a different chapter of the Studebaker story was just beginning. Hamilton in the late 1940s was not a city that needed much introduction. Anyone who worked with their hands in Ontario knew what Hamilton was. The place where the steel was made, where the furnaces ran day and night, where a man could find steady work if he was willing to show up and put in the hours. The city sat at the western end of Lake Ontario, hemmed in by the Niagara Escarpment to the south and the industrial waterfront to the north, and it wore its working-class identity without apology. It was exactly the kind of city Studebaker was looking for. The building on Victoria Street North had already lived several lives before the first automobile ever rolled through its doors. Otis elevators had operated on the site as far back as 1902. During the First World War, the factory produced artillery shells. In 1940, the federal government built a dedicated weapons plant on the same grounds the Otis Fenson facility to manufacture anti-aircraft guns for the Second World War. When the war ended and the guns were no longer needed, the government found itself holding a large, well-built industrial complex in a steel city with a skilled workforce and good rail connections. Studebaker, searching for a Canadian manufacturing base, made an offer the government accepted. The Indiana Company had been assembling vehicles in Canada since before the Second World War, first in Walkerville near Windsor. But this was something different. This was a purpose-committed modern factory, not a converted garage or a leased warehouse. Studebaker was planting a flag. On August 18, 1948, more than 400 employees gathered on the factory floor alongside a battery of press photographers and reporters. The first vehicle to come off the new assembly line was a blue Champion four-door sedan, a solid, unpretentious car that suited the city it was born in. The crowd cheered. The cameras flashed. Studebaker of Canada was open for business. What followed exceeded even the company's own expectations. In its first full year of operation, the Hamilton plant surpassed both its production targets and its profit projections. The workforce grew steadily. The United Auto Workers organized the plant under Local 525, and the relationship between management and labor, while not without friction, was more stable than what Studebaker was managing in South Bend. A strike in May 1959 lasted 25 days before settling, with workers gaining an 18-cent hourly wage increase over 3 years and an immediate 5-cent cost of living bonus. The settlement held. People went back to work. The plant itself covered 320,000 square feet, a footprint that locals compared to 3 Home Depots set side by side. Inside, the rhythm of the place was its own kind of music, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the clank of chassis frames moving down the line, the smell of paint and fresh rubber that clung to workers' clothes long after their shifts ended. At its busiest, the Hamilton plant was turning out 48 vehicles a day across a single shift. Studebaker Canada developed its own character, distinct from the American parent. The Hamilton operation had its own management structure under a Canadian president, its own marketing strategy, and crucially, its own relationship with the Canadian market. While the American company pitched itself as the common sense car, Studebaker Canada went further, marketing directly to the national identity of its buyers. The cars coming off the Victoria Street line were sold as Canada's own car, a claim that was partly promotional and partly true. They were designed in Indiana and engineered in South Bend, but they were built in Hamilton by Hamilton workers for Canadian roads and Canadian winters. The plant also built community in ways that went beyond the factory gates. Employee parties, organized day trips, group benefits that were generous by the standards of the era. These were the details that made the Hamilton operation feel less like a satellite facility and more like a home. Workers who joined Studebaker in 1948 were still there in 1965, their children sometimes working alongside them. That kind of loyalty is not manufactured. It accumulates over years of small decisions made well. For most of its first 15 years, the Hamilton plant did what it was supposed to do. It built cars, made money, and kept people employed in a city that understood the value of both. What the workers on the floor could not see, what no one in Hamilton could fully see, was how completely their future depended on decisions being made in rooms they would never enter, in a country they did not live in. That distance would eventually cost them everything. By the late 1950s, the Hamilton plant had found its stride. The early uncertainties of a new operation, supply chain gaps, workforce adjustments, the learning curve of a factory, still figuring out what it was, had given way to something more settled and more confident. Victoria Street had become a place that knew exactly what it was doing. The product line reflected that confidence. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Hamilton was assembling Larks, Hawks, and half-ton pickup trucks alongside the standard sedan and wagon variants that formed the backbone of Canadian sales. The Lark, introduced for the 1959 model year, was particularly significant. While Detroit was still committed to long, low, chrome-heavy automobiles that drank fuel and demanded wide garage doors, Studebaker had bet on a compact, smaller, lighter, more economical, and priced for buyers who wanted transportation rather than theater. The bet paid off. Lark sales surged. Production at Hamilton increased by 25%, and workers who had been laid off during leaner years were called back to the line. For a moment, it looked like Studebaker had found its way through. The plant hummed. 60 workers on the line became 600. The daily production count climbed. Inside the factory, the assembly process moved with the particular logic of a well-run operation. Each station knowing its role, each worker knowing the next step before the previous one was finished. Chassis frames arrived and were fitted with suspension components. Bodies were dropped onto frames with a precision that looked casual only because it had been repeated thousands of times. Paint booths, trim stations, final inspection, the sequence was the same every day, and the repetition was not tedium, but craft. Beyond the main production runs, Hamilton had developed a secondary operation that said something important about how Studebaker Canada approached survival. In 1962, the company acquired the Canadian distribution rights for Mercedes-Benz and DKW automobiles, importing German vehicles and selling them through its dealer network at a margin of approximately $150 per car. It was an unusual arrangement for an automobile manufacturer, and it was entirely deliberate. Studebaker Canada was not waiting to be saved by the parent company. It was building revenue streams wherever it could find them, using its status as a registered manufacturer to access lower import duty rates that pure distributors could not match. Gordon Grundy, who became president of Studebaker Canada in 1958, was a practical man who understood that a small operation in Hamilton could not afford to depend on a single source of income. The workforce during these peak years numbered around 600, with UAW Local 525 representing the assembly workers and a smaller group of salaried staff handling engineering, administration, and sales. The culture of the plant was something that longtime employees described with a consistency that suggests it was real rather than remembered. There were annual parties, not perfunctory affairs, but genuine celebrations, organized with care, attended by workers and their families. There were day trips. There were group benefits that compared favorably to what larger plants were offering. Studebaker Canada had made a calculation, perhaps unconsciously, that the cost of keeping people happy was lower than the cost of replacing them, and the stability of the workforce over nearly 2 decades bore that out. The 1965 model year brought the clearest measure of what the Hamilton plant was capable of under pressure. By that point, South Bend had been dark for 2 years. Hamilton was operating as the sole Studebaker factory on Earth, a distinction that carried both pride and weight. The production target set by the American parent was 20,000 units, the number the company's financial analysts had determined was necessary to keep the Canadian operation viable. The Hamilton plant produced 19,435 cars that year. It missed the target by less than 3%. Given that it was assembling vehicles without the engineering support, parts supply, or corporate infrastructure that South Bend had once provided, and that it was purchasing engines from McKinnon Industries, GM Canada's engine division in St. Catharines, rather than from its own powertrain operations. The result was not a near miss. It was a demonstration of what the plant and its people were genuinely capable of. The cars themselves were honest vehicles. The 1,965 Studebaker line cruiser, Commander, Daytona, Wagonaire offered no pretense of competing with Pontiac on style or Chevrolet on price. They were built for buyers who had already decided they wanted a Studebaker, which meant buyers who valued durability, straightforward engineering, and the particular satisfaction of choosing something that was not what everyone else was driving. The Canadian market for that kind of car was small but real. Studebaker held roughly 2% of it, against GM's commanding 52%. The gap was not closable, but 2% was something, and something was what Hamilton had to work with. What the production numbers could not capture was the atmosphere inside the plant during those final operational years, the particular quality of a workforce that knew time was short but kept showing up anyway. There is a specific kind of pride that comes from doing difficult work well under difficult circumstances, and the Hamilton plant had it. Workers who were there in 1965 would describe it, years later, as the best and hardest period of their working lives. The machine was running at its limit, and it was running clean. The numbers, however, were already telling a different story. The trouble did not begin in 1963. It did not begin in 1954. If there is a single moment when Studebaker's long decline became inevitable, it was somewhere in the early 1950s. When the Ford Motor Company decided it was willing to lose money in order to take market share from General Motors, and both companies were large enough to absorb the damage indefinitely, while every independent manufacturer in America was not, the post-war seller's market had been good to everyone. Between 1,945 and 1,950. Americans bought cars the way people buy things after a long deprivation, eagerly, without much price sensitivity, grateful for whatever was available. Studebaker had used that window well. The 1,947 lineup was genuinely ahead of the competition. The company invested its wartime profits into new tooling and fresh design. By 1950, production had reached its historic peak, and the future looked, if not exactly certain, at least plausible. Then the Big Three woke up. General Motors introduced new models across its full range. Ford, under the aggressive direction of Henry Ford II and his team of financial analysts, the so-called whiz kids, launched a pricing war that the General was forced to match. The two companies hammered each other with incentives, dealer promotions, and model year refreshes that required capital expenditure on a scale that only they could sustain. For Studebaker, the effect was immediate and brutal. The company's break-even volume was too high for its actual sales, and its actual sales were falling. In 1954, Studebaker reported a deficit of $26 million. For a company of its size, that was not a setback, that was a crisis. The merger with Packard that same year was presented publicly as a strategic combination of two complementary manufacturers. In private, it was a rescue operation for both parties, and neither was in a position to rescue anything. Packard brought prestige and a loyal customer base in the luxury segment, but it also brought its own deteriorating finances and a product line that was about to be compromised by cost-cutting measures that would damage the brand permanently. When Packard began using Studebaker bodies and platforms for its 1,957 and 1,958 models, customers who had paid for a Packard and received what was recognizably a rebadged Studebaker, did not return. The Packard name was finished by 1958. Studebaker Packard Corporation reverted to the Studebaker name in 1962. Having gained nothing durable from the union, and having spent years of management, attention, and capital on an integration that never delivered what it promised. Through the late 1950s, the company made genuine attempts to find a sustainable position. The Lark Compact was the most successful of these, a real product that addressed a real gap in the market before Detroit recognized the opportunity. But the Big Three had the resources to respond quickly once they did recognize it, and they did. By 1960, GM's Corvair, Ford's Falcon, and Chrysler's Valiant had arrived in the compact segment with dealer networks, advertising budgets, and manufacturing volumes that Studebaker could not match. The Lark's moment passed. The Avanti, launched for $1,963, was the last genuine swing. Raymond Louis' design was startling. A fastback sports coupe with a fiberglass body, four-wheel disc brakes that were unprecedented on an American production car, and a supercharged version producing over 300 horsepower. Studebaker gave cars to Frank Sinatra, Johnny Carson, and Dick Van Dyke in an effort to seed the culture with the right associations. The car was genuinely extraordinary. It was also assembled by workers who had never worked with fiberglass before, on a production line that was not equipped for it, in a factory that was already struggling with broader quality control issues. A labor strike in 1962 delayed the launch. The PAF early cars had fit and finish problems that undermined the premium positioning. Production never reached the volumes needed to justify the investment. The Avanti was canceled after one model year. By the time the South Bend Board of Directors met in December 1963, the arithmetic was unambiguous. The American operation was losing money it did not have. On volumes, it could not increase, in a market that had consolidated around three companies with no intention of sharing meaningful space with a fourth. The independent automakers, Packard, Hudson, Nash, Kaiser Frazer, Willys, had been disappearing one by one since the early 1950s. Studebaker was the last one standing, and it was no longer standing comfortably. On December 20, 1963, automobile production at the South Bend plant ceased permanently. Nearly 7,000 workers lost their jobs. Many of them also lost their pensions. The company's pension fund was underfunded, and the legal frameworks that might have protected those workers did not yet exist. The South Bend closure would eventually contribute to the passage of the Employee Retirement Income Security Act in the United States. Federal legislation that reformed pension fund oversight and protected future workers from the same outcome, it was a meaningful legacy. It was also cold comfort to the men and women who had spent their careers on the South Bend line and retired with less than they had been promised. In Hamilton, the news arrived not as a surprise, but as a weight. Workers on Victoria Street had been watching the American situation deteriorate for years. They had read the same newspaper reports, heard the same rumors, done the same quiet arithmetic. What they may not have fully understood, what would only become clear in retrospect, was the nature of the decision that had been made about their plant. Hamilton had not been chosen to carry Studebaker forward. It had been chosen to carry it to a stop. The Canadian operation was profitable. Gordon Grundy had built something in Hamilton that actually worked. Lean, stable, genuinely competitive within its scale. The American parent knew this. They also knew that the Hamilton plant, with its lower overhead and more manageable workforce, could produce cars at a volume of around 20,000 units per year and remain in the black that was useful. Not because it meant Studebaker intended to rebuild from Hamilton, but because it meant the company could continue to honor its remaining dealer franchise obligations, sell down its parts inventory, and wind down its automotive operations in an orderly manner rather than an abrupt one. Hamilton was the controlled descent. The workers on Victoria Street were keeping the lights on for a company that had already decided to leave. They just didn't know it yet. On December 21, 1963, the morning after South Bend went silent, The assembly line on Victoria Street started up as usual. There was no ceremony to mark the transition, no announcement from corporate headquarters declaring Hamilton the new center of the Studebaker universe. The workers showed up, the line ran, and somewhere in the background the reality settled in that this plant, this building, on a street in a steel city in Ontario, was now the only place on Earth where a new Studebaker could be purchased. Not the best Studebaker factory, the only one. The immediate operational challenge was significant. South Bend had supplied Hamilton with engines. That supply chain was now severed, and the Hamilton plant had neither the equipment nor the workforce to manufacture its own power plants. Gordon Grundy moved quickly. Within months, the company had arranged a supply agreement with McKinnon Industries in St. Catharines, GM, Canada's engine division, securing Chevrolet-derived six-cylinder and V8 units to keep the line running. The 194 and 230 cubic inch sixes and the familiar 283 cubic inch V8 were not Studebaker engines. They were solid, well-understood power plants that Canadian mechanics already knew how to service. Under the circumstances, that was exactly what was needed. The product line was simultaneously consolidated. Grundy and his team made the decision to concentrate production on 4 model variants: the Cruiser, Commander, Daytona, and Wagonaire, abandoning the Hawk, the Avanti, and the Truck series that could not be built economically in Hamilton's smaller facility. It was a rational contraction, the kind of triage that a competent manager performs when resources are limited and survival is the objective. The cars that remained were the ones with the broadest appeal and the most stable parts supply. They were not exciting choices. They were the right ones. Production increased. The line moved from a single shift to double, from 48 vehicles per day to 96. Workers who had been on the floor for years suddenly found themselves running a global operation from a 320,000 square foot building in Hamilton. There was a particular pride in that, strange as it sounds. The plant that had always been the smaller, quieter Canadian outpost was now the whole show. Studebaker's marketing team leaned into it. Advertisements in Canadian publications carried the line "Canada's own car," a slogan that had been used before but now carried a different weight. For the first time, it was literally true. Gordon Grundy, for his part, believed in what he was doing. This is worth stating plainly, because the alternative interpretation that Grundy was simply managing a dignified exit is contradicted by his actions. He pursued expansion opportunities. He lobbied the American parent for investment in new tooling. He authorized the purchase of 190 acres on Guelph Line east of Burlington to hold for potential facility expansion land. The company would never use, acquired by a man who genuinely thought there was a future worth expanding into. Grundy was not performing optimism. He was operating from it. In 1965, he was sent to Japan. The mission was straightforward in concept and complicated in execution. Investigate the possibility of a partnership with either Nissan or Toyota, through which Hamilton would import Japanese vehicles and sell them under the Studebaker name through the existing Canadian dealer network. It was not an unprecedented idea. Other small manufacturers had survived through badge engineering arrangements, and the Japanese automakers were actively looking for North American distribution footholds. The conversations with both companies were substantive. Agreements appeared possible. What neither Grundy nor Studebaker's management had anticipated was the intervention of Richard Nixon. Nixon, then a private citizen, between his 1,960 presidential defeat and his 1,968 campaign, had connections in the Japanese business and political world through his law firm's international practice. The precise nature of his involvement in the collapse of the Studebaker-Nissan and Studebaker-Toyota negotiations remains a matter of historical dispute. Sources differ on whether his role was active obstruction or the consequence of competing business relationships, but the outcome is not disputed. Both deals fell through. Hamilton would not be selling Japanese cars with Studebaker badges. The last viable escape route from the coming closure had been closed. Back on Victoria Street, the line kept running. The 1965 model year came together with a discipline that the plant's workforce had every right to be proud of. 19,435 cars, built a number that represented not just competent manufacturing, but genuinely extraordinary effort given the circumstances. The supply chain was improvised. The engineering support was attenuated. The corporate infrastructure that a normal automobile plant relied upon had largely evaporated with South Bend. And yet the cars came off the line clean, the dealers received their inventory, and the customers who wanted a Studebaker could still buy one. The sales figures, however, were moving in only one direction. In Canada, Studebaker held 0.71% of the market. General Motors held 52%. The gap between those two numbers was not a competitive problem with a competitive solution. It was a structural reality, a market that had already decided, through millions of individual purchasing decisions, that the age of the independent automaker was over. The buyers who remained loyal to Studebaker were older, fewer each year, and not being replaced by younger customers who had grown up in a world where the choice was effectively between GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Grundy knew the numbers. He also knew that his plant was hitting its targets, that his workers were doing everything that could be asked of them, and that the decisions being made about Hamilton's future were not his to make. They belonged to a board of directors in the United States, men who looked at the 1,965 results, nearly on target, modestly profitable, genuinely impressive given the constraints, and saw not a foundation to build on, but a line to be wound down on schedule. In early 1966, Grundy submitted a formal request to the American parent for funds to develop a restyled 1,967 model range. New sheet metal, updated interior, modest changes that might have given the dealer network something fresh to sell, and the Canadian market a reason to look twice. The request was denied. There would be no 1,967 Studebaker. The board had made its decision, and Hamilton, the plant that had kept the company alive for 2 years after South Bend, fell silent. The operation that had hit its numbers and held its workforce and done everything right was going to find out what that decision meant. The telegram that ended Studebaker's automotive history did not arrive with any particular drama. There was no emergency board meeting whose outcome leaked to the press before workers found out. There was no last-minute negotiation, no 11th-hour investor, no government intervention. There was simply a decision that had already been made, communicated through the ordinary channels of a corporation in the process of winding itself down, and a plant manager who had to find the words to tell 600 people that the thing they had built together was finished. The financial logic was not complicated. Through 1,965, Studebaker Canada had produced 19,435 vehicles, a genuine achievement that came within 3% of the 20,000-unit threshold the American parent had established as the minimum viable. Volume. The profit margin at that level was real, but thin. Corporate directors in the United States looked at those numbers and performed a calculation that had nothing to do with Hamilton's operational competence. They were weighing a small, stable profit in an isolated Canadian plant against the ongoing cost of maintaining a corporate structure, engineering staff, parts inventory, dealer support, warranty obligations, executive overhead that a 20,000-unit operation could not efficiently sustain indefinitely. The margin was not enough. Not because Hamilton had failed to produce it, but because the companies surrounding Hamilton had become too expensive for any margin Hamilton could generate. The 1966 model year began with the Hamilton plant, carrying a quiet dread that the workforce did not discuss openly, but that everyone understood. Production targets had been quietly reduced. The model range had been trimmed again. Fewer variants, fewer options, less complexity on the line. The cars being assembled in early 1966 were good cars, built by experienced people who knew their jobs thoroughly, but the order books were thin. Dealers who had stayed loyal through 2 years of post-South Bend uncertainty were running out of reasons to keep ordering inventory that was increasingly difficult to sell. By the time 1966 production was complete, the Hamilton plant had built 8,947 vehicles, less than half the previous year's output, and well below any threshold of viability. The collapse in volume was not primarily a manufacturing problem. It was a market problem. Canadian buyers who might have considered a Studebaker were being offered the full model ranges of GM, Ford, and Chrysler companies with national advertising campaigns, dense dealer networks, and the implicit assurance of permanence that comes from size against that Studebaker Canada was offering honest, well-built cars from a company that everyone could see was in trouble. The loyal customers kept buying. There simply were not enough of them. On March 4, 1966, Gordon Grundy called the workforce together. The meeting was held on the factory floor, the same floor where 48 workers had watched the first champion roll off the line in 1948, where 600 people had built nearly 20,000 cars the previous year. Grundy told them what they already suspected and had been hoping was not true. The Hamilton plant would cease automobile production. The last vehicles would be completed. The line would then stop, permanently. What followed those 13 days was not chaos or bitterness, at least not publicly. The workers on Victoria Street made a decision, collectively and without anyone instructing them to, that they would finish the job. The cars on the line would be completed properly, to the same standard as every car that had come before them. There would be no cutting corners on the final run. If Studebaker was going to end in Hamilton, it was going to end the way it had always operated, with the work done right. The city absorbed the news with the particular stoicism of a place that had seen plant closures before. Studebaker was Hamilton's 10th largest employer. 700 people were losing their jobs in a single announcement. The local papers covered it. The union issued statements. The mayor expressed concern. But there was no provincial emergency response, no federal retraining program announced within days, no coordinated plan for what those 700 workers would do next. Hamilton, in 1966, still had its steel mills. Stelco and Dofasco were both operating at substantial scale, and the assumption, not entirely wrong, was that displaced Studebaker workers would find their way into other industrial employment over time. Some did. The transition was not as smooth as the assumption implied. What no one said aloud, though some must have thought it, was the particular cruelty of the timing. Hamilton's plant had done what it was asked to do. It had hit its numbers in 1965. It had maintained its workforce, preserved its quality standards, kept the line running under conditions that most automotive operations would have found prohibitive. The reward for all of that was 13 days' notice and a final paycheck. The telegram that Studebaker sent to its remaining dealers in the days following the March 4 announcement was brief and without sentiment. It stated that losses in the automotive division had become too great for the corporation to sustain continued production. It did not thank the dealers for their loyalty. It did not acknowledge what they had risked by staying with a struggling brand through the years since South Bend. It was a business communication from a company that had already moved on, addressed to people who had not yet been given the chance to. 13 days remained. The line was still running. And somewhere near the end of it, a turquoise cruiser sedan was taking shape, though no one on the floor yet knew it would be the last one, or that it would end up in a museum 800 kilometers away, in the city where Studebaker had begun. The morning of March 17, 1966, began the way every morning at the Victoria Street plant had begun for 18 years. Workers arrived through the same gates, hung their coats in the same lockers, took their positions at the same stations on the same floor. The routine was muscle memory, by now hands that knew where to reach before the mind had finished forming the instruction. If you had walked through the factory at 7 in the morning on that Thursday and looked only at the work being done, you might not have known anything was different. But you would have known. The air inside the plant carried something that did not have a name in any operations manual. Not grief. Exactly, grief comes after. This was the thing that comes just before, when the end is certain and close, and there is nothing left to do but get through it with your dignity intact. There were 8,947 cars in the 1966 model year run, By the morning of March 17, nearly all of them had been completed. What remained on the line was a single vehicle, a cruiser four-door sedan, finished in a color the factory records listed as Timberline turquoise. V8 engine, 283 cubic inches, sourced from McKinnon Industries in St. Catharines. A big, solid, unhurried car of the kind that Studebaker had always built, not the fastest thing on the road, not the most fashionable, but built to last and honest about what it was. The workers who completed it that morning did so with the same attention they would have brought to the first car off the line in 1948. That was not an accident. It was a choice, made without a meeting or a memo, arrived at through the unspoken agreement of people who understood that how you finish something is as much a statement of character as how you begin it. Every bolt was torqued to spec. Every trim piece was fitted clean. The final inspection was not rushed. When the car reached the end of the line, the accounts differ on exactly who produced a banner. Long and white, hand-lettered in the style of a parade float or a graduation display. It read, "More Studebakers from Hamilton for the world." Workers helped tie it across the hood of the cruiser, the fabric running the width of the car, the words facing forward. It was an act of defiance so quiet it almost wasn't one, a declaration that this ending was not a failure, that what had been built here had mattered, that Hamilton had done its part and done it well. The car was driven slowly through the factory floor. Workers stepped back from their stations to watch it pass. 600 people, men and women who had given years of their working lives to this plant, who had come in after South Bend closed and kept the line running when every external indicator said it was pointless, who had hit their targets and maintained their standards and shown up every morning, stood in silence as the last Studebaker moved toward the doors. There are no photographs from inside the plant at that moment that have survived in wide circulation. What exists instead is the memory of the people who were there, recorded in interviews and local histories over the decades that followed. Those accounts are consistent in their details and consistent in what they emphasize: the quiet, the banner, the car moving slowly, and the particular feeling of watching something end that you had believed in. The doors opened. The turquoise cruiser rolled out onto Victoria Street in the pale March light, the banner still across its hood, and that was the last Studebaker automobile produced anywhere on Earth. Gordon Grundy watched it go. The man who had run the plant since 1958, who had gone to Japan to find a lifeline that Nixon's interference had cut, who had submitted the tooling request for 1,967 models that was denied without serious consideration. Grundy stood on the floor of a factory that had produced 179,325 vehicles in 18 years and watched the final one leave. He had told reporters 3 months earlier that all indicators seemed favorable. He had believed it when he said it. The distance between that belief and this morning was the measure of everything that had gone wrong at a level above his reach. The workers dispersed. Some stayed to clean their stations, a final act of professional habit. Some went directly out the gates onto Victoria Street. A few gathered in small groups and talked for a while before going their separate ways. The machinery was quiet for the first time in years. The paint booths were cold. The assembly line, which had run continuously since August 1948, stood still. The following morning, March 18, Studebaker officially ceased to exist as an automobile manufacturer. The corporate entity continued. It would go on to merge with Wagner Electric in May 1967, then with Worthington Corporation in November of the same year, eventually becoming Studebaker Worthington, a manufacturer of industrial equipment and engine components that had no connection to the car business beyond the name on the letterhead. But the thing that the Hamilton workers had been part of the making of automobiles, the craft and the noise and the daily discipline of building something real from steel and rubber and glass that ended on March 17, 1966, on a factory floor in Hamilton, Ontario. The turquoise cruiser, the last one, was eventually transferred to the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. It is still there. The car that ended Studebaker's history sits today in the city where Studebaker's history began a full circle, that no one planned, and that carries, in its geometry, something close to meaning. Visitors to the museum can walk up to it, read the placard, and understand intellectually what it represents. What they cannot fully recover is the atmosphere of the morning it was made, the quiet factory, the banner, the 600 people stepping back from their stations to watch it pass. That morning belongs to Hamilton, and Hamilton, for its part, has never entirely let it go. The gates on Victoria Street closed on March 18, 1966, and did not reopen for automobile production. What happened next to the building, to the workers, and to the city followed the pattern that industrial closures in mid-century Canada tended to follow a pattern of slow adjustment, partial recovery, and the gradual replacement of one kind of work with another that was never quite the same. The 700 workers who had been on the Studebaker payroll found themselves navigating a job market that was, by the standards of later decades, reasonably forgiving. Hamilton in 1966 was still a functioning industrial city. Stelco and Dofasco, the two great steel producers anchoring the waterfront, were both operating at substantial scale and hiring regularly. Other manufacturing plants in the region, food processing, chemicals, electrical equipment, provided additional options for workers with assembly line experience and UAU cards. The assumption that Studebaker's workforce would be absorbed into Hamilton's broader industrial economy was not wrong. It was, however, optimistic about the timeline and the terms. Skilled tradesmen, the millwrights, electricians, and tool and die workers who had kept the Victoria Street plant running generally found equivalent work within months. Their skills were transferable and in demand. Assembly line workers had a harder time. The jobs available to them in Hamilton's other plants were not always comparable in wages, benefits, or working conditions to what Studebaker had offered. And the gap between what they had earned and what they were being offered was a recurring source of frustration in the years immediately following the closure. Some workers took the available jobs and rebuilt. Some left Hamilton entirely. Toronto was growing rapidly, and the construction trades were active enough to absorb people willing to learn new work. Some never found employment that matched what they had lost and carried that disparity quietly into retirement. There was no federal retraining program, no provincial adjustment fund, no coordinated government response to the closure of Hamilton's 10th largest employer. This was not unusual for the era. The architecture of worker transition support that later generations would take for granted employment, insurance reform, skills retraining, subsidies, community adjustment programs was still being built in Canada in the 1960s, and it was being built partly in response to closures like this one. Studebaker's workers in Hamilton were among the people whose experience demonstrated the need for those programs, even if they did not benefit from them directly. The building on Victoria Street continued to have a life, if not the life it had been built for. Otis Elevators, the company that had occupied the site in various forms since 1902, that had manufactured shells there in one war and anti-aircraft guns in another, that had sold the property to Studebaker in the years after the Second War ended, reacquired the complex and used it as a warehouse and distribution facility until 1987. It was unglamorous work for a building of that size, but it kept the structure standing and the property maintained. After Otis departed, Allen Candy moved in and used portions of the facility for confectionery production until 1997. Then the building waited. In 2012, the decision was made to demolish the majority of the complex to make way for the Hamilton Central Business Park, a development intended to attract light industrial and commercial tenants to the north end of the city. The demolition was not controversial in the way that later generations might expect. Hamilton in 2012 was a city still working through the consequences of steel industry contraction, still trying to find the economic identity that would carry it through the 21st century, and a disused former candy factory on Victoria Street did not generate the kind of organized preservation campaign that comparable structures attract today. Most of the concrete and steel that Studebaker workers had walked through every morning for 18 years came down. What survived was a 3-story brick and beam section at the corner of Victoria Street North and Ferry Street East, approximately 30,000 square feet of the original structure, preserved as the centerpiece of a planned 120,000 square foot flexible office development. It is a handsome remnant, the kind of industrial architecture that later generations have learned to value precisely because so much of it was lost before that lesson was absorbed. As of the early 2020s, the broader business park had attracted limited tenancy, with geotechnical contractor Studebaker Canada among the occupants of the redeveloped site. At the eastern end of the property, where Wentworth Street North meets Mars Avenue, a small park with a playground now occupies ground that once held the assembly line. In September 2016, 50 years after the last cruiser rolled out of the factory, a modest historical plaque was dedicated at the park, acknowledging what had stood there and what had been made there. It is the kind of memorial that suits Hamilton's character: understated, accurate, placed where ordinary people walk rather than where officials gather. The street that runs through the redeveloped site is called Studebaker Place. The name is the city's way of holding on to something that the demolition crews could not reach: the fact of what happened there, the record of what those workers built over 18 years, the particular significance of a Canadian factory that became, for a brief and unlikely moment, the last place on Earth where a Studebaker could be made. Studebaker, the corporation, completed its own dissolution with the quiet efficiency of a company that had long since stopped caring about its own story. The merger with Wagner Electric in May 1967 produced Studebaker Worthington, following a subsequent combination with Worthington Corporation in November of the same year. The new entity manufactured industrial turbines, pumps, and engine components, the products with no connection to automobiles and no use for the Studebaker heritage, beyond the recognition value of the name. When McGraw-Edison acquired Studebaker Worthington in 1979, even that tenuous connection was severed. The Studebaker name disappeared from American business entirely, surviving only in the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, the institution that now houses, among other things, the turquoise cruiser that Hamilton built on March 17, 1966. The workers who made that car are, most of them, gone now. The building where they made it is mostly gone. What remains is a plaque in a park, a street with a name, and a car in a museum a long way from the city that gave it its last coat of paint. It is not nothing, but it is a great deal less than those workers deserved. Studebaker was not the first independent automaker to disappear. It was the last. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Hudson had gone in 1954, absorbed into American Motors. Nash followed the same year, in the same merger. Packard ceased to exist as a genuine entity by 1958, its name surviving only on rebadged Studebakers until even that pretense was abandoned. Kaiser Frazer, Willys, Crossley, the roster of American independents that had existed in 1945 and were gone by 1960, is long enough to constitute a pattern rather than a series of individual misfortunes. Each closure had its own specific causes, its own particular sequence of bad decisions and bad luck and structural disadvantage, but the pattern beneath all of them was the same. The American automobile industry in the post-war period was consolidating around three companies that had achieved a scale of production and a resulting cost structure that made meaningful competition from outside almost impossible. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were not simply larger than the independents. They were operating in a different economic category, one where the fixed costs of design, tooling, and marketing could be spread across millions of units per year rather than hundreds of thousands. When they chose to compete aggressively on price, as Ford and GM did in the early 1950s, the independents had no equivalent response. They could not cut prices without cutting into margins. They could not afford to lose. They could not maintain prices without ceding the market to companies that were offering more car for less money. The trap had no exit that did not require a scale of capital that no independent could access. Studebaker's particular tragedy was that it understood this clearly and responded with genuine intelligence and genuine effort. And it was not enough. The Lark was the right car for its moment. The Avanti was a genuinely remarkable machine. The decision to consolidate in Hamilton after South Bend closed was operationally sound. Gordon Grundy ran the Canadian operation with a competence and a care that the circumstances did not reward. The workers on Victoria Street hit their targets, maintained their quality, and kept the line running under conditions that most automotive operations would have found prohibitive. None of it was sufficient, because the problem was not one that competence could solve. The market share numbers tell the story without sentiment. Independent automakers held 19% of the American market in 1948. By the time Studebaker closed South Bend in 1963, that share had fallen to 7% across all remaining independents combined. By March 1966, when Hamilton built the last car, it was effectively zero. The consolidation was not a process that could have been reversed by better management, or better products, or better luck. It was structural, the consequence of an industry reaching a scale where only the very largest participants could survive, and then enforcing that scale through the ordinary mechanisms of competitive markets. What makes the Hamilton chapter of this story distinct, and worth telling separately from the broader Studebaker narrative, is what it reveals about the relationship between corporate decisions and the communities that absorb their consequences. Hamilton did not fail Studebaker. Hamilton performed. The Canadian operation was the profitable remnant of a failing enterprise, and it was used as such as a mechanism for managing the decline of something that had already been decided to end, in a way that minimized disruption to corporate obligations and maximized the orderliness of the exit. The 700 workers on Victoria Street were not consulted about that strategy. They were informed of its conclusion with 13 days' notice. This is not a unique story. It is, in many respects, the defining story of 20th century North American industrial history, repeated in steel towns and textile cities and auto plants, from Hamilton to Windsor to Oshawa, to every community that built its identity around a factory, that eventually decided, for reasons made in offices far away, that it was time to leave. The specific details change. The structure does not. A community invests in an industry. The industry, when the mathematics shift, withdraws. The community is left to work out what comes next, without the resources or the warning that might have made the transition manageable. What Hamilton did with that story is, in the end, the more interesting question. The steel mills kept running for another generation, providing the economic foundation that allowed the city to absorb the Studebaker closure without catastrophe. The workers who lost their jobs in March 1966 were, most of them, employed again within a year, not in the same jobs, not at the same wages, not with the same sense of belonging to something they had helped build, but employed. The city diversified, the university grew, the healthcare sector expanded. Quote, end quote, quote, end quote, end quote, end quote, quote. I'm glowing their other, end quote, 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 end quote. Hamilton became, over the following decades, a more complex and more resilient economy than the one that had depended so heavily on industrial production, a transition that was painful in its specifics and necessary in its direction. The building came down, the plaque went up. The street kept the name. Absolute, the building, the name. The building, the building, the building, the building, the building, the building, the building. And in South Bend, Indiana, in a museum dedicated to a company that began as a blacksmith shop in 1852 and ended in a Canadian factory in 1966, a turquoise cruiser sedan sits behind a velvet rope. It is the last one. The placard beside it notes the date and the place of manufacture. Hamilton, Ontario, March 17, 1966. And visitors who read it and understand what they are reading will know that the end of Studebaker was not an American ending. It was a Canadian one, made in a steel city, by workers who showed up for the last shift the same way they had shown up for every other shift, on time, prepared, and determined to finish the job properly. There is no more honest epitaph for a factory than that. And there is no more honest epitaph for the people who worked in it. The last Studebaker on Earth was made in Canada. Hamilton made it. And Hamilton sent it out into the world with a banner on its hood, because that is the kind of city. Hamilton is the kind that does the work, finishes what it starts, and does not wait for someone else to say that what it built was worth remembering. It was, it is, and now you know.